1 Corinthians chapter 1. And I want you to begin reading with me in verse 18 of that context. 1 Corinthians 1, verse 18. For the word of the cross is to those who are perishing foolishness. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the cleverness of the clever I will set aside. Where is the wise man? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not come to know God, God was well pleased through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. For indeed, Jews ask for signs and Greeks search for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. To Jews a stumbling block, and to Gentiles foolishness. But to those who are the called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. For consider your calling, brethren, that there are not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble. But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things which are strong. And the base things of the world and the despised God has chosen the things that are not, that He might nullify the things that are, that no man should boast before God. But by His doing, you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God, and righteousness, and sanctification, and redemption, that just as it is written, let him who boast, boast in the Lord. The church at Corinth, to whom Paul penned these opening words in his first letter to them, had problems. They had problems that he's going to address later in the book with immorality. They had problems with taking each other to law to settle their differences, whether that was to small claims court or whether it was to settle other grievances. That's the way they were dealing with their problems. They were a people that were divided. He says in verse 10 of the text that they were not same-minded. They were not speaking the same thing. They were a divided people. And it's a little surprising to me it's surprising to me when I begin reading 1 Corinthians in chapter 1 and how Paul deals with the fact that they were a divided people, that he starts where he does. But I hope we can appreciate, as we look a little closer at the context this morning, the wisdom of why Paul begins where he does. He begins with them at the cross. He begins with reminding them of the message of the cross, the word of the cross. Because the things that caused them to be divided as a people all started with a wrong kind of attitude and with a wrong kind of heart. There were elements of pride. There were elements of elitism. There were elements of, there was a party spirit. There was an element of preference. There was a desire for position, or there were power plays that were going on in terms of having position or of authority. And all of those things, all of those are chased away. All of those are defeated when we come back to the cross and when we're reminded of its message. If we are going to be God's people here, if we're going to be God's mission, we have to be a people that master the message of the cross. It's got to be the thing that defines our attitude. It's got to be the thing that prevails in our thinking. It's got to be the kind of, it has to be the model for how we behave toward each other and how we behave and how we behave toward the world. We've got to start there. And so it's there that Paul begins as he writes to these Corinthians about the thing that needed to drive their behavior, their unity as a people. I want you to notice what he says about the whole message of the cross, because this seems so foolish to start here. And he says that the message of the cross, the word of the cross, is folly, and it is a stumbling block to the world. Look at what he says at verse 22 of the text. He says, "For indeed Jews ask for signs and Greeks search for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, to Jews a stumbling block, and to Gentiles foolishness." Now, why is it that the word of the cross was foolishness to the Greeks, and why was it a stumbling block to the Jews? Why was it foolishness to Gentiles? Why was it a stumbling block to the Greeks? What were they looking for? The idea of God becoming a man and living among us was not a novel thing. What I mean by that is the Greeks had notions about that. If you read the Greek mythologies, they were replete with stories about gods. You know, they didn't think of one god, they thought of gods. But they were replete with stories about gods coming and living among mankind. Gods coming and looking like men and acting like men. But in their theologies, when gods came and lived among men, they really did act like men. I mean, the reason why a god might become a man was so he could sleep with a beautiful woman, so she could become his consort. And so that he could have children that then become demigods, that were half God and half man. And in their notions, in their mythologies, gods became men so that they could win the sympathies of a city that might rally behind them as being their deity. Or they might become a man so that they can manipulate men in some way. Or they could help their favorite army or help their favorite king. Or they might rally people around them against some other god that was their enemy. And so those were the notions of man becoming a flesh in the Greek mythologies. And those were the kinds of gods that they esteemed, were gods that acted like man and no better than man. Now, the notion of God becoming a man was not something that the Jews were expecting. They were expecting a Messiah. They were expecting a promised one, that God would come, that would sit on the throne of David. But they weren't expecting God to come. That was something that the Jews weren't looking for. The way that Jesus came, the way that God became man, was something that was foolish to Gentiles in their notions of God, and was a stumbling block to the Jews in terms of their notion of God. You see, when the gods became men in the Gentile world, that they showed their strength. I mean, they came and they showed their mastery of men by their power, by the way that they united an army, or by the way that they manipulated, or by the way that they outwitted other gods, or by the way that they outwitted humanity. They didn't come to be selfless. They didn't come to suffer. Gods didn't become men to be weak. Gods became men so that they could be stronger. And for the Jews, they were looking for a Messiah who would come, but a Messiah who would make them look great. That they wanted a Messiah who would come and would make them a great nation. In fact, not just a great nation, they wanted a Messiah who would come and make them the greatest nation. They wanted a Messiah who would come and who would whip Caesar all the way back to Rome. They wanted a Messiah who would come and would make Jerusalem an exalted city, and would make them an exalted nation, and bring them an exalted army. They wanted to rule the world beside the Messiah that God would bring them. But God sent His Son, and His Son became a man. And not a man that lived in a great family. a man who lived in a poor family. God sent His Son, and God's Son was a Jew. Now that is foolishness to Greeks, because the Jews were nobody. And so He sent His Son to a nobody nation, to a nobody town, to a nobody family. And His Son did things that make no sense. He didn't call rich people. He didn't call wise people. He didn't go and get the philosophers. He didn't go and get the media specialists who could wow the world with their messages. He went and He called guys that were fishermen. What do they know about preaching? He went and He got a guy that was a tax collector. How's He going to win any credibility with people? He went and He called these humble guys who were no class and nobody too. And He did signs and He did wonders, but He did signs and wonders for pitiful people. Why waste a miracle on a leper? Why waste a miracle on a blind guy that was a beggar? Why waste your time in helping people that are pitiful people, that are small in the world? Why not do something? Why not do big things that will wow the world and will really get people's attention? But He didn't do that. And because he wasn't who people were looking for, and because he didn't come, he did have conflict with those who were religious leaders who were hypocritical, but he allowed himself to be arrested by them and to be condemned by them and to be crucified. It doesn't make any sense that God would become a man and be regarded as an insurrectionist, as somebody who was leading a rebellion against Rome, to be regarded by His own people as a blasphemer because He taught them that He was the Son of God. It doesn't make any sense that God would come and be put in an electric chair, which would be the modern equivalent, or undergo lethal injection. I mean, how would a message about God coming and being executed by our culture, by our society, being condemned, what good does that do mankind? How does that help us? What good does it do for us? But He came. And He was executed. And He did die on a cross. So that He could take away our sin. And so that He could take away our sin in a way that was a spectacle to the world. Because it was so unexpected. And because it was so humble. And that message is at the core of who we are. Now, what's wise about that? I mean, what's helpful about that message that God's Son would come and would die on a cross for us? Well, that is wisdom. That is wisdom. And it's wisdom in this way. Which of us thought of that? Who among mankind figured that out? It's startling to me that by the time that Jesus came, all of the really wise people upon which whether you're talking about Western culture, or whether you're talking about Eastern culture, whether you're talking about Occidental societies or Oriental societies, nobody thought of this. Nobody imagined this. But all of the real wise people had spoken. There is no philosophy that is cultivated in modern society that by the time of Jesus didn't exist. I don't care what world religion you're talking about. I don't care what kind of philosophical thinking. I mean, there are new religions in name that have originated since that time. But in terms of fundamental doctrines or beliefs or philosophies, everything, by the time that Jesus came, somebody had thought of it. Somebody had not only thought of it, they'd written it down. They'd written a book about it, or written a paper about it, or written an essay about it. And you could search the annals of the things that the Romans had written, or that the Greeks had written, or that the Chinese had written, or that the Jews themselves had thought about as they looked at the books that God had delivered to them by the prophets. And nobody was expecting Jesus. Nobody. And what is so wise about God is that He came in a way that none of us were expecting. It did not enter our mind. We were not thinking of this. We were not looking for this. And when we see it, when we understand it, it humbles us. And we need to be humbled. We need to know how not smart we are. We need to know how foolish we are. We need to see that our inventiveness and our creativity and our wise thoughts and our planning, even when we collaborate together, even when we try to do something big together. I mean, the Romans might conquer the world, and the Greeks might build beautiful buildings all around the world, and even our art forms and those kinds of things. The mastery of all that had been done by Jesus' times and is just being embellished in our time. But what good did all of that do for us? So we had pretty buildings. So we invented democracy. So we could make a war machine. But we were all still going to hell. Our wisdom didn't do anything for us except mean that we were lost. And so the cross of Jesus, it is the wisdom of God. It's the thing that none of us thought of and that none of us imagined. And it is the great equalizer of mankind because we all recognize just how foolish we were. So the cross is the wisdom of God. Number two, the cross is the power of God. The cross is the power of God. Because in the cross, we not only have, we have a defeat that is in reality a victory. We have in the cross a man who dies, but a man whose death brings life. Because the message of the cross is not a message of just a man dying alone on a tree. It is a man dying alone on a tree for us, for me. A man dying alone on a tree so that I can be reconciled to God. A man dying alone on a tree so that he could be put in the ground and so that he could go and he could conquer death for us. So that we could live. And so the message of the cross is a message of a great victory where God has, through Jesus, conquered death, conquered sin. So that we find in the message of the cross power. Power to undo Satan. Power to undo all of the bad stuff that's in the world. And there is a lot of bad stuff. But the cross can fix it. Jesus can fix it. And the cross is the message of that. It's the power of God. And so just as the wisdom of God humbles us, the power of God moves us to want the victory that God brings. The word of the cross shows us the wisdom of God, it shows us the power of God, and it shows us the wrath of God. when I look at the cross, I need to see that that's what I deserve. The cross is the death that I should die. Do you really believe that? I mean, do you believe your sin is that bad? My sin is that bad. I deserve to be spit on. I deserve a crown that's not made of gold. I deserve a crown that's made of plaited thorns. I deserve to be hung on a tree and made a spectacle to people. That's what I deserve. And so the cross, the word of the cross, shows us the wrath of God. It condemns us when we see the cross. Number 4, the word of the cross shows us the heart of God. It shows us the heart of God. I can't imagine another way. I can't imagine a better way for God to communicate to me, for God to communicate to us, that He will do anything to have a relationship with us. Can you? His Son. His Son. I'm not a parent, but I know how we love little Omar. My sister was here last weekend and she brought her 3 kids, and I love little Forrest, who's 15 now. I love him like he were my son. And Eva and Lila, I love them like they were my girls. I would not give them for you. I would not do that. You don't deserve that. And would you give your child for me? Would you? Surely not. God gave His Son for you. He gave His Son for me. How could we question whether He loves us? How could we question whether He wants us? And when we see the heart of God, that transforms us. When I see that God loves me that much, when I comprehend His grace, it makes me want to change. It troubles me that I sin. It troubles me that I think things that are not right to think. It troubles me that I think things, say things, do things that are not like Him. And what breaks my heart about all of that is that God has shown me His heart for me. And He has that heart for me. When I'm a sinner, He has that heart for me. And it makes me not want to be a sinner anymore. Does it make you do that? Does it make you not want to be bad? If it doesn't make me want to be bad, if it doesn't make me not want to be bad, if it doesn't make me want to be good for Him, then I haven't really thought about the cross the way I should. Because in the cross I see the heart of God. Number 5, the word of the cross shows me the mission of God. It shows me the mission of God. This is what I mean by that. I can take the cross and I can go to war for God. You got problems in your marriage? I tell you what you need to learn to master is the cross towards your wife and towards your husband. If we would learn to give up more and not try to be the boss, if we would learn to surrender more and not try to win the argument, if we would try to behave in ways that reconcile relationships, and I don't care if that's in our marriage or in our workplace or in our friendships, if we didn't have to win, if we didn't have to look strong, if we didn't have to be the one that has the answers, if we could learn to just live the cross in our relationships, they would all get better. Now, I can't make other people do that, but I can do that. It can start with me. I can look at what Jesus did, and I can surrender too. I don't have to win. I don't have to look big. I don't have to be important. I can hurt for this relationship. I can hurt for this friendship. I can hurt for this family. I can hurt for my brother. I can be defrauded. I can do that. The cross arms me to do that. Now, if that's not the weapon that you're carrying, if that's not the way that you win in relationships, if that's not the way that you're trying to behave toward other people, whether they be lost people or saved people, I just mean people. If that's not then you're not carrying God's weapons. You're not fighting the way He fights. You're not going to war the way He goes to war. That's where Paul said for the Corinthians to start. It's where I need to start. I tell you what happens. It happened at Corinth. When they had problems, the people all turned inside in their fuss. And they just let the city go to hell. And we do that. When we become enamored with whatever our fuss is or with whatever our problems are, whether they be problems in our family, if they be problems in our personal life, I mean, the mission of God just gets ignored. We just focus on our stuff. But I tell you, when you focus on God's mission, it's amazing how many things take care of themselves. When we take the message of the cross and we go save the world with it, I mean, not we, Him, but we go sow and we go water and we go plant, we go serve, we go preach, we go live the message of the cross, then God wins. God wins. Finally, could I say to you that the word of the cross is how we learn the mind of God. It's how we learn the mind of God. I want you to look at where Paul ends up when he gets to chapter 2 in verse 16. He says, "Who has known the mind of the Lord that He should instruct him?" That's a quotation that's taken from Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 13. And Paul answers that rhetorical question. Who's known the mind of the Lord that He should instruct him? I mean, really the answer to that question is nobody does. The answer to that rhetorical question is that none of us know the mind of the Lord. We can't instruct God. God has to instruct us. God has to tell us. We won't tell Him anything. There's nothing we're going to learn God. God has to learn us. But here's the marvel, is that God has spoken. God has taught us. And the result is that we have the mind of Jesus. We have the mind of Christ. And where was that mind? Where was that mindset expressed? It's expressed on the cross. Paul would say to the Philippians, "Let this mind be in you." Philippians chapter 2, verse 1, which was also in Christ Jesus. Who did as our brother prayed, who emptied Himself and taught us the same. Taught us to empty ourselves. The cross is just the way that God thinks. And because it's the way that God thinks, it's the way that God acts. And so the cross needs to become the way that we think. And it's the way that we behave. And it's the wisdom that works. It's the wisdom that works. It's the mindset that unites us. It's the mindset that Paul was saying needed to unite them. The word of the cross, it is foolishness to the Greeks. It's a stumbling block to the Jews. But it is the wisdom of God. It humbles us. The cross is the power of God. It moves us. The cross is the wrath of God. It condemns us. The cross shows us the heart of God that transforms us. The cross shows us the mission of God. It arms us for battle. And the cross shows us the mind of God. It's the mindset that unites us. So the word of the cross, how's that message working in you? Every community is united by a culture. We have an American culture, and their values and their beliefs, their historical events, their freedoms, the privileges that all unite us. There's art and songs, and all of those things are the American culture. Well, there's a culture. There's a culture among the people of God. And it's the culture that Paul is trying to communicate to the Corinthians. And that culture is the culture of the cross. That's the thing that unites us. It's the culture of the cross. And it unites us, it moves us in all those ways that we've talked about today. It needs to be our culture. And the more that we subscribe to the culture of the cross, the more useful we become to God, and the bigger blessing we are to one another, and the more we embrace His purpose as His people. I pray that if you're not a Christian this morning, that the message of the cross moves you. Would you not be humbled by what God has done for you? Would you not be transformed by seeing His heart there? Would you not see how foolish your life is without Him? And would you not embrace the forgiveness, the victory that Jesus has made possible for you at the cross? Won't you come to Him as together we stand and as we sing?